Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Cortez Rodriguez, and I'm here to talk to you about Konstru. I'm also here with my fellow colleagues, Charles Portelli and Shannon McMullen. I believe they're like literally sitting right in front in the virtual seat. That's pretty funny. But anyway, okay. So we're the team representing Konstru. Feel free to check out our booth as well, um, and also ask us any questions anytime you like. Without further ado, let me talk to you about the Konstru. So, welcome to Konstru. Konstru, to be specific, is an environment for building data. And as you can see on the screen, there's this logo with all these like recognizable icons. I'm sure some of you might recognize them from different software platforms you may or may not use, or software platforms you might have to like interface with for just basically getting your project into development. But what does it mean when we say an environment for building data? It's kind of an ambiguous term, right? Where is my text? Oh, sorry. Konstru, my apologies. Konstru is in other words, it's a common data platform. But of course, with any common data platform, you need to worry about security, especially with all of the things that go into project. Oftentimes, some of the things go into project are very high profile or just very sensitive towards publicity and all that. So to start off, Konstru is web-based. It is very secure. It has a centralized data repo, and it also tracks your projects. In other words, project history and change management. We'll talk about this more in detail later on in the presentation. And as I mentioned, building data, building information modeling, it does integrate itself into the idea of automated BIM. And of course, since it's kind of like a common data environment, it's fully transparent BIM viewer, but that also collects your BIM data or building data from many different sources, like shown in the previous slide. Now, the term data or common data environment automatically shares itself to or lends itself to the idea of data plus community. In other words, common, meaning shared by, coming from, or done by more than one belonging to or open to, or affecting the whole community or the public. Belonging to two or more qualities. You can think of common as the idea of community, or the community representing the idea of a team. You have many different people working on a project at all times, and not everyone shares the same knowledge or even the same lingo or the way they speak. So we find something to sort of create a commonality between everybody. Data, like we mentioned, buildings are complicated and have a lot of information. So facts, statistics collected together for reference or analysis. And lastly, environment, kind of where we put all this together into one. In other words, Konstru. An overall structure within the user, computer, or program can operate. In those three kind of examples, there's a very specific user, computer, and program, because we do talk about people interacting with Konstru, as you or I. Computer, as in obviously computer, and program, meaning the different software and platforms that go into BIM and just general data management for buildings. So let's actually talk about that more in detail. So cross-platform connectivity. As you saw in the previous slides, there was a couple of icons that were familiar, such as eTabs, Excel, Grasshopper, Dynamo, Tekla, SAP, Autodesk Revit, RAM structural systems, Rhino, which is kind of like assumed to be bundled up with Grasshopper. And of course, like in the near future, we could be working on adding even more platforms. But right now, the goal is to focus on the primary platforms that are used within the BIM industry. Sort of reiterating on the concept of the common data environment, Konstru acts as a sort of center to all of these, where it can connect and sort of unify all of these different pieces of information into one cohesive model. Now, when you think about unifying data from Revit to like an eTabs model or like a Rhino model towards a Tekla model or literally any direction, it already kind of seems daunting because it's like very different applications that handle elements and geometry very differently, even data. Thankfully, Konstru is sort of like a bridge in this case that lets you kind of connect all these different pieces of information and put it together into one model. So kind of leading up to that concept is the idea of a building to data. More specifically, the way we like to look at it is a data silo, right? So a building is this complex object with many, 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 many features. And then we have a silo, which is kind of like this hub, this container that collects things. In this case, collecting data. Now you think about Konstru, you can convert any building with any piece of information into a Konstru model. But of course, Konstru isn't just for one model, one project. It's more, like we said, a common data environment. So it's a collection of projects of data silos. You can think about it like this. Every single data silos is a project you're working on or a building you're developing. And that contains a series of informations ranging from all sorts of different things down to analysis, all the way up to more like geometrical kind of design changes. Here's a little diagram that kind of like visually explains what we're trying to say. So if you think about your data silo, you have a building, and of course, there's many design phases, such as concept design, schematic design, design development, construction designs, and so forth. Many things happen, right? A lot of things happen. Buildings tend to grow and change. Sometimes they can manipulate themselves from a little tiny one story, couple story building to like a full blown tower, as you see on the screen. But the point is, like, no matter what kind of changes your project is going towards, Konstru can be integrated to assist and also contain the historical changes and data that happens. So you can think about this as like, in an example, if you think about BIM, right? BIM is not just building information modeling about one specific building. You also have to think about all the history that went into every single change. So Konstru keeps track of all that. So now that we talked about sort of the overall concept of Konstru, wrapping up of sort of the diagrams and explaining like what it is, what it can be, and what it can be applied to, we've also compiled a series of examples that can help you better understand what is Konstru, how to use it, how to apply it, and how has it been applied and used in the past. These are some screenshots of some projects that we'll touch upon, and we'll also talk about how Konstru has helped them kind of get to where it is today. Now, one thing I do want to talk about is the idea of flexibility and scalability. I'm going to mention this a lot as I go through, but the point is Konstru is not limited to a number of projects, nor is it limited to a type. And lastly, it is not limited to a size of a project. You can be working on something as large as like the Hudson Towers, or something smaller like a pavilion or an art sculpture installation. Really is up to the user to decide what gets integrated into the platform and what comes out of it. One of the examples here, we have Lucas Museum of Narrative Arts. If you are not familiar with it, it is an up and coming museum that's getting built in Los Angeles. It's currently under construction. And Konstru greatly helped this project carry through all of its design phases and now I believe CD phases, looking more towards how they decompose a facade and how the facade went from these sort of ambiguous, weirdly shaped spaceship-like panels to something more rational. But the point is, when you're dealing with something so unusual, you often have to deal with different software and different people involved, right? Think of Rhino, or in this case, even Maya, if you're familiar with that platform. That was what they originally designed the thing in. But then, you have to bring it into SAP, you have to bring it into ETABS for analysis and just understanding, can this thing stand up? Of course, through all these developments, we have to take into account like this is one massive complex, so we have to sort of keep track of everything as it evolves. Konstru allowed that translation and sort of data management be a lot easier than having to import, export, and rebuild things across platforms. Ultimately, here's an example of one of the biggest things Konstru helped on is basically allowing teams to combine forces and be able to connect facade with the main structure with, of course, the overall architectural intent. In other words, eventually Revits for documentation purposes. Another example is via W57. Now, this one's kind of a fun example that pokes at the earlier diagram we had, where we talked about the whole thing kind of evolving from like a smaller building to a larger building to a much larger building, right? But the point is, like, Konstru can be integrated across any phase of the project. It doesn't have to be A, B, or C, like specifically. It can be integrated early on and then kept as a record and then reintegrated back or used to streamline the entire process of development. And as we can see here, this is the final model, or final structural model, I should say, representing the conditions of the finally built the F57. Additionally, for those of you who are interested in analysis, Konstru does support a certain degree of analysis information on your elements. So that's also very useful when you're sort of creating reports and data and transferring between other platforms. Another project changing scales here, as you've noticed, we went from a large scale unusual museum to a sort of unusual residential tower or pseudo tower to now more of a standardized institution, I should say. Still funky geometry, but what's interesting about this project is that Konstru was used in a numerous different ways, sort of showing the power and flexibility of it, where you're not sort of tied to it at any given moment, and you can integrate it as you need. Now, as we know, most projects do not have a standard workflow. They kind of go really all over the place when things are developing from point A to point B to point C, right? In this case, Konstru was used to be able to translate all the changes back and forth between Revit, Tekla, CSI tabs, and whatnot to just help the project get across and also carry the information and make sure that nothing gets left behind, but of course things get updated as it goes. So in short, a very powerful tool to make sure the project gets developed and things aren't redone, right? Here's another example, just saying the final model, how it became a combination of various different software platforms, RAM, SAP, and ultimately Revit, documentation, right? All got combined together to produce this final model that can be conserved and saved in Konstru, but then ultimately transferred out for other purposes if need be. Another example shows this is the National Museum of Intelligence Special Operations. It's another museum that's currently, I don't know if it's under construction, but it's getting there. Another example is Konstru does have a various amount of features that are more than just talking about data and containing. It talks about the idea of flexibility and even fixing. So in this case, if you have a model that might not be connected, let's say you have a couple elements that are just ever so slightly off, we have what's called framing repair. And Konstru can take a given model, upload it from Revit or eTabs or whatever your platform of choice is. It can analyze the elements and basically connect them together to ensure that connectivity. And as we all know, when you're dealing with building data, you want to make sure things are accurately connected, obviously to reflect its real state, and ultimately to also show the building correctly. So for documentation purposes, you definitely want the drawings to show the elements connected. Now, there's a couple other things I do want to touch up on besides framing repair. And Konstru also has a series of other integrated flexibility and functions that I could spend a long time just explaining and going over here. This is kind of like a snapshot and overview of the overall platform. But here, what we're really going to look at is, for example, a project that has to deal with a point cloud. Konstru can help the teams process this and basically help the project carry it out. So let's say the team develops a point cloud and they develop a Revit model based on this. They can transfer it out to another platform and then do what they need to do and bring it back and essentially just get the project through. So in other words, there is no particular format that can stop from Konstru getting integrated. Konstru can get integrated regardless of what the project requires. One more thing I do want to mention, like I mentioned the initiative earlier, was a sculpture from Conceptual to Real. This project used Konstru to basically take it from a highly conceptual level of just this weird mesh that basically got rationalized and eventually informed into more finite elements for engineering and ultimately fabrication. Those elements can be taken through Konstru, and Konstru can hold the fabrication data, and then people can use that model to understand it. And again, it's a web viewer, so you have a whole team who can access this at any time. You're not necessarily tied to an application. You can just go on the web, go into the account, and it's fun. Lastly, to kind of like wrap up here, these are some just kind of feedback we've gotten over the past few years about different companies, different people we've worked with, just saying, the positivity of Konstru and how they've been able to apply it across different conditions and different projects. And it's always nice to see the product is getting used effectively and it's actually doing what it's intended to do. So much. If you have any questions, please ask or check us out at the booth.